Alright, hi everybody. Welcome to this week's lecture on power. So when we talk about power, for this lecture anyway, and your book will go much more into detail as well as some of the videos I've posted this week, but it's important to start by thinking about how power is represented by looking at how rulers are represented. So as we know, power is inherent in rule. It's just something that kind of happens and comes with rule. Rulers have, throughout the history of the world, used art to portray themselves in a positive way to broadcast their power. And this is something that happens to this day, right? Our contemporary rulers are constantly trying to portray themselves positively in a variety of ways as well. For instance, in the 9th century, before the Common Era, the Assyrian king Ashur-nasirpal, I can never say this correctly, Ashur-nasirpal II, built a capital around his fortress, which was nearly 5 miles long, and along the walls of his fortress, he had, the whole thing was carved with these low reliefs. And remember, that's a term that we've spent time talking about earlier when we spoke about sculpture. So we know that a low relief is what we have here. So it's basically something that has been carved out, but that is the carved out surface is quite low. So this is in contrast to high relief, where we have objects that are carved out of the background almost into a sculpture in the round. Okay, but anyway, that's a whole different point. So here we have a low relief sculpture, and here we have the king represented with lions. So he's killing lions. So this is an important point, because as we know, throughout the history of power and visuality, we often have the representation of lions, because lions often are a way for people to associate themselves with power. Because lions, of course, are the king of the jungle, right? They're the most powerful animal in the jungle. So oftentimes you have kings representing themselves with lions and often overpowering lions. So here you have the king doing just that as he's about to kill his horses, trample this lion up front, and then he's about to shoot an arrow into this lion back here. This was specifically designed to celebrate and underscore his military prowess. Of not only the king but also the Assyrian army. Okay, so you can see a couple of his military men who are represented here as well, so they're kind of part of this power complex. We've also talked about this one before too, but I wanted to mention it again in terms of power. Here we have the Emperor Jing Shi Huangdi, who was buried in 210 before the Common Era, and he was buried basically with his military. So here you have over at least 6,000 infantrymen who have been specifically carved out one by one. It's another important thing to note is that each one of these figures is actually different in some way, right? They're all carved to look slightly different. So that's really important, right? There's an attention to the individual here, the individual member of the king's military, who have been placed around his tomb where he was buried. So they're here to protect him, but also once again to represent his kind of military prowess. So 1,800 years later, we also see the similar thing happening with Napoleon Bonaparte. So this is a ruler that we all probably know. He's kind of a part of our pop culture in some ways. And he is one of the first rulers to create an official state art program. He really did realize how important the arts were for depicting and visualizing power, especially as a king. And so he would commission official portraits of himself quite frequently. So he would do this not only through paintings, as you see here, but he'd also create sculptures and architectures which glorified his power. So let's look specifically at this painting here. Here again we have a depiction of The king himself on a horse, this is similar to the Assyrian king. We have an association with the power of the horse as well, a powerful animal who often leads one into battle. So here we have the king himself on a horse, this beautiful white horse. You can see the horse's muscles throughout the body. Realism is attempted here. The artist is Jacques-Louis David. We've already talked about Jacques-Louis. Remember, he was a neoclassical artist. So here he was one of Napoleon's very favorite artists. So he was commissioned for many of his portraits. Another thing to note about Jacques-Louis David is the fact that he was a neoclassical artist also is important because, right, he tied himself through his paintings to the classical past. So that's to say, the classical power that we associate with ancient Greece and Rome, two of the most important and powerful empires within, especially recent history for Napoleon. And so here he's tying himself to that history by commissioning a painter who is tied to that history as well through his style of painting. So here's the problem with this painting, though, is that it's actually representing more of a myth than the real man. So in truth, Napoleon was at the back of the rally riding a mule, even though here it looks as though he's riding this amazing, beautiful, strong horse. Seems to be at the front of a rally, heading into battle, crossing the Alps. His hand is outstretched. He's pointing towards the Alps, moving his army forward, when really he was actually at the back of his army because he was terrified to go into battle. And as you can see here, he's got all other sorts of identifiers of power. So he's using color to identify power, right? We have gold. We also have blue. We recognize that those are two important colors that are often associated with royalty. And it would have been difficult to dye blue fabrics at this time, or it would have been more expensive anyway. And so oftentimes we have that associated with wealth as well. He's draped in this giant, amazing kind of gold fabric, which would have not been useful at all for him. Probably would have been actually quite heavy. So here again, we know that this is not really a realistic portrait, but rather it is a propagandistic portrait that was designed to create a myth of the leader. I also like to bring up this painting just briefly. It's a contemporary work by Kehinde Wiley. He's a contemporary artist who works with historical works. As you can see the resemblance here between the two pieces. And I like to bring this up at this point in the semester because I know many of you are working on your final projects. And I know that I think this is a nice example of how you can kind of look to an historical example, like Jacques-Louis David's Napoleon crossing the Saint Bernard, next to Napoleon leading the army over the Alps, which is from 2005, where the artist is specifically looking to this painting, being inspired by certain aspects of it, right? He's inspired by the elements of power that are associated with this kind of pose of a king on the horse like this, leading people into battle. But then he brings it to contemporary men who he meets on the street, oftentimes in urban spaces, men who are underprivileged, often in America, black men who really don't have much power in their everyday lives, and he's placing them here into a position of power by placing them into a painting that would be completely associated with power of the king. So we'll move on, but I just wanted to bring that in when we're as you think about how you might kind of alter a historic painting or use bits and pieces of a painting but make it completely your own. Alexander the Great is another one of these leaders who is oftentimes depicted as a powerful figure in the ancient world. During his lifetime, but especially after his death, many sculptures were created to celebrate him. He also had a portrait done of him in a sculpted portrait, as you can see here, and this would have been one of many kind of sculpted portraits of him. And oftentimes he was completely recognizable. So oftentimes you've had this disheveled hair. You see this here with the mosaic as well. A kind of intense gaze, as you see here. His mouth is slightly open. His head alertly kind of turned, tilted to the side. And this is very common of the ways in which his artists would represent him. Notice that his eyes look past us, as if he's looking beyond the present to greater things, and this would have been called the Imperial Gaze. And it happens often in paintings throughout the history of art. Here you have Chairman Mao, represented in the 60s, with that same type of gaze. The ruler gazes beyond us. He gazes similarly to Alexander the Great, to something in the future, right? Something that is greater than us in the future. And this is, again, very common throughout the history of art. We also see it with Augustus. So he's doing the same thing here, but even more so, he's using the gesture, right? The gesture of the orator, right? He's speaking to a crowd, but again, he looks off into the distance with that imperial gaze. So art in the age of Augustus, here we have one of the most powerful kind of empires was the Roman Empire, as we've already talked about. And Augustus was one of the most important emperors. As we know from the week when we spoke about Rome, he undertook an extensive series of building projects when he was emperor. He also built complex roads and bridges to make his army more mobile, so that's important. It's all about military prowess. And it's also important to note that during his reign, we have a new kind of Roman style of idealism, which in many ways revived classical Greek ideals. So let's take a look at this for just a second. Here again we have portraiture as propaganda. It really expresses kind of the myth of the man rather than the man itself, okay? It expresses authority as rooted in traditional stories and styles, yet there's a recognizable likeness which is rendered. Many people, if you would have, been living in the time of Augustus, you would have seen this and you would have known it was him. This is typical of how he would look in his sculptures and in paintings. I've already talked about the orator stance just a little bit. He's leading the people, right? He's talking about something. He's giving a lecture, perhaps. He's also here in contrapposto, specifically tying himself to the ancient Greek past of canonical proportions. And we're not going to go into kind of the things that are happening on his vest. Those are covered slightly more in your book, I believe, but feel free to look into those. But there's all sorts of mythological and historical imagery here, which also would define his power in some way. And as I said, the portrait of Augustus would have been very idealized. And so here you see kind of a young man represented in both of these busts of the emperor. And even as he aged, his sculptors, the people who sculpted him, would still render his face youthful, no older than like 24, right? So he was always, even though he may have been, in his 60s when this was sculpted, he still looks like a young, handsome man. So this goes also for art, the art of South America. So here we have King Pakal. Here we have a stucco portrait of the king's head. This is a classical Mayan representation of beauty. So the extreme kind of oval of the face, the elongated nose as you see here, the high cheekbones, and the open mouth. Those are all kind of classical modes of representing beauty for classical Mayans at the time. once again, we have the representation of a youthful king. And youth is important, right? You'll see, we've also seen at points in this class where kings have been represented as older. I think it was during the Roman week. And sometimes you see the representation of wrinkles on older men, and this would have been associated with wisdom. And so I think this makes a lot of sense for us now. Like we still represent, or we still associate wrinkles and old age with wisdom, and it was not very different back then as well. And so sometimes you see that, but here you see a youthful king. Same goes for the Emperor Augustus. And here he's represented as the corn god. So you can see these husks that are associated with corn as part of his headdress. And this also references the cycle of life and death because it goes along with kind of the cycle of harvest of corn every year. This would have also been covered in jade and red cinnabar, so it wouldn't have just been kind of the color of the stone like this. It would have been painted elaborately with these two kind of rare stones that it would have been the rare stone of jade and then the red cinnabar, which is actually a toxic kind of mercury sulfide mineral, which would have covered the sculpture as well. Also, when I talk about power, like to talk about, to bring it more to the present, I like to talk about the Black Panther Party and the visuality of the party. Here, I like to note, these are the two leaders of the party. The party was started in the late 1960s by Huey Newton, represented here, and Bobby Seale, represented here. Here again, you see Huey Newton. And I love this portrait of him because I think it harkens back to kind of those, 16th, 17th century portraits of kings where we have a throne, we have weapons represented, we have the front-on gaze. We also have kind of a uniform that's represented here. And this all has to do very much with power. We have this zebra rug on the floor. You can just barely see. And these guys were the first ones to come up with, well, the artist for the group, Emory Douglas, was the first one to come up with the idea of the pig, the policeman as a pig. And so that's kind of where we have the flourishing of that imagery, even though Dada artists were on top of this kind of metaphor of the police's pig much earlier in the 1920s. But when we think about power, I like to bring up the images by Emory Douglas of women in the party, because I think when we oftentimes think of the Black Panther Party, we like to, the images that come to mind are those of black men with guns, leather jackets, black berets, kind of in that uniform. But really there were, in 1969, there were 75% of the party was women. And so it's important to note that they were an important force in the party. They were oftentimes educators. They were oftentimes in charge of the free lunch programs and the free clothing programs, free education programs that went on that were free to black communities at the time. And they were, 75% of the party. So I'd like to bring that up when we think about imagery of power, because there are actually some images, as you see here, these would have been in the weekly newspaper, the Black Panther, images of women in powerful positions in the party. Even though these women are kind of represented as like stereotypical turn of the century like black mammies, that is to say servant women, they actually they have these revolutionary tools, right? They have guns and knives, so they're ready to fight the revolution. There's also an emphasis in the Black Panther Party at this time in women as powerful figures for their ability to birth. And so there was many writings at the time in the 60s and the 70s where women were told that the way that they could be most revolutionary was to have children, because then they would, bear the next revolution, the next generation of revolutionaries. So oftentimes we have women represented in positions of power in the fact that they had the power to birth. And so here you see two women with children and guns in the same hands. And then we also have these kind of androgynous images of women who have, giant muscles, have kind of like male features in some ways, who are straight up taking up arms and ready to fight for the revolution. And it's not just a man who, would represent women, even though Emory Douglas is most famous for his work on the Black Panther Party. We also had women making drawings for the newspaper as well, where you see representations of men and women in revolutionary roles of power. And then the last thing I wanted to bring up, I wanted to go to the African continent to talk about the Luba people. When we talk about power, and actually, I think I'm going to talk about a few other things too after this. But I like to bring up the Luba people who are from the Democratic Republic of the Congo in Africa. So be sure to look that up on a map if you're not sure where that is. And the reason I like to bring this up in terms of power is because, oftentimes when we think of most societies in the world, most societies are patriarchal, right? That is to say that men are more powerful often in certain societies. And here, while men oftentimes do hold the most powerful positions as kings in the Luba communities, a woman is seen as being stronger than a man in certain important ways. So that is to say that here we have represented a woman who, within the society, the idea is that only a woman is strong enough to contain a powerful spirit, like a king, like that of a king's. So there's this idea within Luba kind of custom that that when a king dies, his spirit lives on, it leaves his body, and it has to enter the body of a female who would be named a Mwadi. So I'll go to the next slide to show you that term. But I also wanted to mention that that's why we see all these, this is kind of our work of the arts of kingship, right? So kings would have owned objects like these, because it shows just how important females are within this society, because we have these important figures, especially called Mwadis, and you can see how you spell the term here. And these women, again, would have been very important because this is how and the ancestral kings were kind of reincarnated into these female figures, because it was the idea that only a female had a strong enough body to harbor the king's soul, and keep her own soul. Because the idea was that if a man was to try to harbor the king's soul would overtake the male's soul. But however, there's this idea that women are strong enough to allow the king's soul to be incarnated in the woman's body. So that's why we have so many figures of females here in the courtly arts of the African Luba society. And here we have a stool itself. The stool is very important within Luba society. The figure here becomes the seat, kind of the seat of the spirit of the deceased king. Stools could also be understood in general to be, because they depict these women, they could in general be associated with kind of the importance of female ancestors. Alright, I think this is actually the last thing I'm going to get to today in this lecture. I feel like it's already getting a little long. Excuse me. So here we have one of the most kind of important and earliest feminist pieces to be created in kind of the history of art. This is by Judy Chicago. It's called The Dinner Party, and it's basically literally a huge dinner party that the artist has created, including 39 place settings for dinner for 39 mythical and historical female figures. And then in the center, we have this giant floor, a tile floor, in which we have at least 1,000 names inscribed. These are all names of mythical and historical female figures. Each one of these place settings that you see here is hand painted china. You know, there's a plate itself that is handmade, hand painted. We have ceramic flatware and a chalice that's been provided for each place setting, and a napkin that's been embroidered with a gold edge and information about the specific historical figure. The floor at center is called the heritage floor, as I said, with about 1,000 women's names from history. So let's look to a couple of these place settings. So these are all completely homemade, right, by Judy Chicago and her workshop of men and women who worked with her. Here we have Hypatia. So this is all, you know, embroidered for this place setting for the specific individual in history. It's unlikely that anyone's heard of Hypatia, and that's the idea. So all of these women in history are oftentimes overlooked or forgotten figures who really didn't have much power at their time and failed to make it into history books today. So Hypatia was actually a Greek mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher in Egypt during the Byzantine Empire. And so you see here her plate has been specifically created for her, as well as her silverware and her chalice. Here we have a more perhaps popularized figure, Sojourner Truth. She was an African-American abolitionist and women's rights activist. She's well known for her speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" at the Ohio Women's Convention in 1851. Here you have a specific plate, once again, for her, and then a specific place setting. Just a couple other ones. Isabella d'Este, she was an important figure during the Italian Renaissance, one that probably should come up when we talk about Lorenzo de' Medici, the patron. She was also a leading patron of the arts and a fashion icon, but is oftentimes overlooked, and instead Lorenzo de' Medici gets to be in the history books. And then we have a space dedicated to the primordial goddess. So here we have a Paleolithic myth of Mother Earth, the sacred female force responsible for the creation of the earth and all of its flora and fauna. So here you have kind of a representation of kind of a animal skin of some sort underneath this amazing plate, and notice that the plate itself kind of represents a female phallus in some ways, and this is very specific and common when we look at these plates. So overall, and here's the floor again, you see a variety of names. The idea behind this work is to kind of recapture and reassess the history. Right? History is a story about him, right? It's a story about important men. It's history. But the idea here behind this feminist work is to introduce her story, is what we oftentimes call this. And that is to say, it's to reintroduce women into history, whether it be, you know, the history of philosophy, the history of mathematics, the history of art, the history of science, the history of cinema, all these things, places where women have often been overlooked and written out of the history books. And so this artist is placing them back in the spotlight through this work and creating a giant dinner party for them all, for many of them, I shouldn't say them all. Judy Chicago was also known for a space she created called the Woman House. And I'm actually going to skip over this right now because I don't want to go too long on this lecture. But you can look it up. I don't think it's actually not in your book, but it's something that I just wanted to show you. So her and Miriam Shapiro, another artist, they co-founded this institute, which is called the Women's House, or the Woman House, when it's a house that they just dedicated to women. So there's a variety of different rooms, and you can take a look. There's a lipstick room and a kitchen, Um, whoops. And all these variety of other rooms that have everything to do with femininity. So when you enter into this space, you're kind of bombarded by all things woman. And so reasserting power, especially in the art world here, um, through installation and kind of environment. Um, so reinserting kind of the power of femininity and womanhood into kind of these public art spaces. And so that's all that I have for today. I cut out a lot to make this kind of shorter because it's two big, lectures this week otherwise. But I hope you enjoyed that, and let me know if you have questions. Your book goes much more into detail on some of these things. A few of these I've just added on my own. So let me know if you have further questions. I hope everything's going well with your final projects. Just one more week. Next week we'll talk about environmental artists, and then we'll finish off the semester. So let me know if you have questions, and I look forward to talking to you soon.